They did not all arrive on the same trail, but they met at the same crossroads. Three figures, each shaped by the wild and unforgiving land, gripped weapons that told their stories better than any book. The warrior, the outlaw, the lawman. Where their paths intersected, blood often followed. But before the bullets flew and steel rang out across canyons and clearings, there were choices of materials, of technique, of purpose. The weapons of the West were never mere tools. They were extensions of spirit, status, and survival. Before the West was called wild, before maps dared to sketch its mountain ranges or rivers, the native nations had long since mastered the art of weapon making. From obsidian points to sinew-bound bows, the arsenal of the indigenous warrior was as sophisticated as it was spiritual. Weapons were not forged in factories but in ceremony, each arrowhead chipped with patience, each shaft straightened by fire and purpose. The bow was more than wood and string. It was often crafted from the ash or hickory tree, its limbs responding to the seasons, the curve as much a reflection of the maker's spirit as it was a feat of engineering. The draw weight varied, some barely 50 pounds, others powerful enough to drive an arrow through bone. In the hands of the Comanche, whose mastery of mounted archery bordered on the supernatural, these weapons became thunderbolts, launched with uncanny precision at full gallop. The arrows they carried, barbed, sometimes poisoned, fletched with turkey feathers, whistled through the air with deadly finality. For many tribes, such as the Apache or Lakota, close-quarters combat demanded blades, stone knives, and then iron ones, traded or scavenged from settlers. Tomahawks, too, had their place, but not as crude instruments of savagery as the dime novels would later portray. They were multifaceted, tools, weapons, ceremonial symbols. Some tomahawks bore peace pipes in their hafts, a brutal irony in times of war. But the winds of war would bring new tools, long before the Winchester ever gleamed in a shop window. Trade introduced muskets to native arsenals, first clumsy flintlocks, later the faster-firing percussion cap rifles, yet their adoption was strategic, not wholesale. The reloading time, the unreliability in damp weather, and the weight made them useful in certain scenarios, but inferior in the rapid skirmishing style of many tribes. A warrior who could fire one shot and reload in a minute was no match for the man who could release 6 arrows in the same time. Even still, native gunslingers emerged, men like the Cheyenne's Roman Nose or the Lakota's Gaul, who learned to wield captured or traded firearms with cunning and effectiveness. Their use of firearms did not replace the old ways. It augmented them, bridged the gap between worlds colliding. Yet their weapons, like their land, were often taken, replicated, or erased by the tide of expansion. That expansion came not only on wagons and railways, but on horseback, holstered in the leather of men who called themselves outlaws. They did not make their weapons. They bought, stole, or bartered for them. And with each year, the tools of their trade became faster, deadlier, more reliable. In the early days, the percussion revolver, such as the Colt 1851 Navy, offered 6 shots of black powder fury, although it still required a lengthy reloading ritual involving loose powder, a ball, and a cap. But with the coming of metallic cartridges and the advent of the cartridge revolver, men like Jesse James or John Wesley Hardin found their fingers twitching beside tools of unparalleled power. The Colt single-action army, dubbed the Peacemaker, became iconic not because of Hollywood, but because it was fast, reliable, and lethal. Chambered typically in .45 Colt, it was said to fire with a sound like justice cracking across an empty street, yet few men fired from the hip, as the legends claimed. Outlaws shot from cover, from ambush, from rooftops and brush, anywhere the terrain favored escape over confrontation. Rifles, too, played their part. The Henry rifle, a predecessor to the Winchester, allowed for 15 rounds to be fired before reloading, a game changer in any skirmish. The outlaw who carried one had a fighting chance against a posse, if only briefly. The Winchester 1873, called the gun that won the West, found its way into saddlebags and stagecoaches, not for its symbolism, but for its function. It shot straight, fast, and hard, and could put down a man or a deer with equal efficiency. But not all outlaws were gunslingers. Some were con men, safecrackers, or rustlers who carried knives or derringers. Those small, palm-sized pistols with 1 or 2 rounds meant not for battle, but for last-chance situations. A gambler in a saloon might conceal a Remington over-under in his vest, praying he'd never have to use it, but knowing he likely would. Yet if the outlaw lived in shadows, the lawman stood, theoretically, in light. His tools were meant not only for violence, but for authority. His badge shone, but his pistol gleamed brighter. The marshal, the ranger, and the sheriff chose their arms with intention. The Colt Peacemaker was standard, but not exclusive. Some favored Smith & Wesson's top-break revolvers, which were quicker to reload under fire. Others kept shotguns, short-barreled coach guns, behind the bar or in the office, loaded with buckshot that left little to chance. The lawman's rifle might mirror the outlaw's, a Winchester perhaps, but his holster was often custom, his rig balanced to draw with speed, born not of chaos, but of practice. Wyatt Earp carried a long-barreled buntline special. Bass Reeves preferred a pair of Colt .45s. These weren't mere preferences. They were reflections of character, of strategy, of myth in the making. Yet even the lawman's arsenal was only part of his power. He often had a deputy, a posse, and sometimes the authority to summon the army. And when the U.S. cavalry entered the field, their weapons changed the equation entirely. Carbines, sabers, and later Gatling guns, early machine guns with a hand crank, shifted the balance with mechanical terror. In battles like the one at Wounded Knee, technology and firepower overwhelmed even the most skilled native warriors. The weapons of the West were evolving, and with them, the very nature of conflict. But the story was never just about firepower. It was about philosophy. The native weapon was born of the land, tied to ritual and necessity. The outlaw's gun was a tool of rebellion, power seized rather than granted. The lawman's arsenal was a symbol of imposed order, sometimes noble, sometimes corrupt. These weapons did not merely kill, they represented worldviews in collision. Even so, the weapons themselves bore witness to human hands, calloused, scarred, sweating with fear or resolve. A bow carved by a Blackfoot hunter in the 1820s might sit beside a Winchester once fired by Billy the Kid. A tomahawk buried near a settler's cabin may never tell whether it struck in aggression or defense. A Colt found on a marshal's hip in Dodge City may have ended a dozen lives or none. And still they echo in museums, in collections, in the private drawers of descendants. The weapons endure, silent yet eloquent, still carrying the scent of gunpowder and pine. Some of these weapons outlived their wielders by centuries. Others were buried with them, honored in death as they had been wielded in life. Native graves sometimes include arrowheads or blades, which are considered offerings to the spirit on the journey. Lawmen, memorialized in stone, may have their sidearms preserved in glass. And the outlaw? Sometimes he dies anonymous, his weapons sold at auction decades later, his name forgotten, but his trigger pull remembered. The myth of the West remains inseparable from the weapons it birthed. They were not just tools of survival, they were instruments of identity. A Comanche bow, a Colt Peacemaker, a rusted Derringer, they all told stories, whispered into the wind and carried across generations. They did not create the legends, but they enforced them. And in the final tally, it wasn't the most bullets or the sharpest blade that defined victory. It was the hand that held it, the intention behind the blow, the judgment behind the shot. In the end, the arsenal of the American frontier wasn't defined by steel or powder, but by the quiet decisions made at dawn. In the chill before a duel, or in the silent preparation before a raid. Choices made not just in combat, but in character. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of the weapons of the West, not what they destroyed, but what they revealed. If the clash of steel and the echo of hooves stirred something in you, if the stories behind the weapons made the myths feel real again, then let them live on. Like this video so others might find it. Subscribe to walk further with us into the shadows and light of the American frontier. And in the comments, tell us which weapon or whose hands left the deepest mark on history for you. Because out here, the past isn't finished. It's just waiting to be remembered by voices like yours.